Scout wasn't digging at the cabin. He was clawing at frozen earth beneath an uprooted pine, while Caleb's flashlight caught a straight metal edge where no metal should have been. Snow hissed through the trees as Caleb dropped to his knees. Scout barked once, then scraped harder until something rusted appeared beneath the roots. Caleb reached toward it, but fresh boot prints beside the hole stopped his hand cold. Someone had been here first, and the tracks led back toward his $1 cabin. What do you think Scout found? The headlights swept across the windshield at 2:13 in the morning. Caleb Brooks was awake before they reached his face. His right hand snapped down beside the driver's seat, fingers closing around empty air where, for one confused second, his body expected a rifle to be. Nothing. Just the cracked vinyl seat, a cold gear shift, an old coffee cup rattling in the holder as a tractor trailer rolled past on the highway. Caleb stayed perfectly still. The truck stop outside Bozeman slowly returned around him. Sodium lights, diesel engines, a glowing open sign across the parking lot, frost silvering the hood of his battered Ford. Afghanistan disappeared. Montana came back. A warm nose touched his wrist. Scout was curled awkwardly across the passenger side floorboard, all 70 pounds of German Shepherd folded into a space designed for grocery bags. The dog lifted his head and watched Caleb. "I'm good." Scout didn't move. Caleb rubbed a hand over the dog's ears. "Yeah, I know." Only then did Scout lower his head again. 11 nights. That was how long the Ford had been home. Caleb had learned which truck stops tolerated overnight vehicles and which deputies tapped on windows before sunrise. He knew where he could wash up for free, where coffee was cheapest, and which public land pullouts had enough tree cover to keep October wind from hammering the truck all night. At 45, those weren't skills he had expected to need. There had been better years. Years when he wore army boots instead of work boots splitting along the seams. Years when people depended on him to study a road and notice what didn't belong there. Then Afghanistan ended for him. The habits didn't. Neither did the sounds. After the army came construction crews, equipment maintenance, roofing jobs, warehouse work. He could fix nearly anything if somebody gave him tools and enough time. Keeping his own life assembled had proved harder. The last maintenance contract ended in September. 2 weeks later, the room he rented disappeared with it. Scout never complained. The dog simply moved into the Ford as though cramped seats and cold nights had been part of the plan all along. At 6:40 that morning, Caleb fed Scout beside the truck, poured instant coffee into a dented steel mug, and opened an envelope he'd collected from the post office the day before. The return address belonged to Sarah Whitman, an attorney in Livingston. The first sentence made him read it twice. Frank Brooks was dead. Great Uncle Frank. Caleb hadn't seen him in years. Frank had spent most of his life surveying mountain property, county roads, ranch boundaries, and timber parcels across western Montana. He was lean, quiet, and almost impossible to impress. When Caleb was younger, Frank had taught him how to stretch fence wire, read a topographic map, and tell whether an old boundary blaze had been cut by an axe or scarred naturally. They had never been close. But Frank had never treated Caleb like something that needed fixing either. The letter said Caleb was named in the estate. 3 days later, he drove to Livingston. Sarah Whitman's office occupied the second floor of an old brick building overlooking a street lined with bare cottonwoods. Scout came with him. Caleb didn't leave the dog in vehicles unless he had no choice. Luke Brooks was already there. Caleb's cousin looked almost exactly as Caleb remembered, only more expensive. Clean boots, wool coat, stainless watch, the kind of haircut that required appointments. Luke's eyes moved from Caleb's faded jacket to the Ford visible through the window. "Long time." "Yeah." Luke looked at Scout. "Still hauling that dog everywhere?" Scout sat beside Caleb's leg. Pretty much. 2 other relatives attended. Frank's niece received his savings and household contents. A nephew inherited his pickup, tools, and equipment. Luke received several pieces of surveying gear and a utility trailer. Then Sarah reached Caleb. Frank left you real property. Luke leaned back. Caleb looked up. Sarah slid a county assessment across the desk. There was a photograph clipped to it. A small cabin sagged beneath tall ponderosa pines. One porch corner had collapsed. Moss darkened the roof. A window had been covered with plywood. The county assessment listed the structure's contributory value at $1. Luke saw it. A laugh escaped before he could stop it. $1? Nobody answered. Luke looked at Caleb and shook his head. Frank found the only real estate worth less than your truck. One relative smiled into her coffee. Caleb didn't. He had heard men laugh under worse circumstances. He had learned a long time ago that humiliation only grew when you fed it. Beneath the table, Scout leaned firmly against his knee. Caleb rested 2 fingers against the dog's neck. Sarah continued. The cabin is on a small recorded parcel in the mountains west of town. Approximately 1.7 acres according to the current county description. Access is by an old logging road. Utilities? Caleb asked. Unknown. Well, possibly. Foundation? I haven't inspected it. Luke smiled again. Caleb, just make sure the outhouse comes with the $1. Caleb finally looked at him. Luke's smile weakened. Not because Caleb threatened him. He didn't. Caleb simply held his gaze a second longer than people found comfortable. Then he looked back at Sarah. Taxes current? Yes. That mattered. Any liens? None shown. That mattered more. Caleb picked up the photograph. A ruined porch could be rebuilt. A roof could be patched. Rotten boards could be replaced. He had spent enough years around structures to know that ugly and unsalvageable were not the same thing. And there was something else. Tonight, if he refused this place, he would sleep behind another truck stop. Tomorrow night, too. Maybe next week. Maybe when the first serious snow came. A cabin with a bad roof was still a roof. A broken home was still somewhere Scout could stretch out without sleeping beneath the dashboard. I'll take it. Luke blinked. Sarah studied Caleb briefly. It's already yours. Frank transferred it through the estate. Caleb folded the property document once and slipped it inside his jacket. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Luke passed him near the door. Seriously, Caleb, if you want somebody to haul the place away, call me. Caleb opened the door. Scout followed. Take care, Luke. Outside, cold October air came down from the mountains. Caleb had reached the stairs when Sarah called after him. Mr. Brooks. He turned. She waited until the others had gone. Then she reached into a desk drawer and placed something in his palm. An old brass key. It was heavier than he expected. Dark with age, polished bright along the teeth from years of use. Frank left specific instructions concerning that property. Caleb looked at her. What instructions? Sarah hesitated. If you were alive when he died, the cabin parcel was to go to you. No substitution, no offer to another beneficiary, no sale through the estate. Caleb frowned. Why? He didn't explain. Behind Sarah, Luke had stopped near the bottom of the stairs. Just for a second. He had heard. The amused expression disappeared from his face so quickly, another person might have missed it. Caleb didn't. Luke looked toward them, then immediately reached for his phone and continued outside. Caleb closed his fingers around the brass key. Something old stirred inside him. Not fear. Not yet. It was the feeling he'd once had looking down an unfamiliar road overseas when every obvious detail said ordinary. But one small thing didn't fit. Frank had owned tools, money, equipment, things any practical man could use, yet he'd made special instructions for a ruined cabin worth $1. And Luke Brooks had stopped smiling the moment he learned about them. Caleb walked outside. Scout waited beside the Ford. The truck looked worse in daylight than it had in the estate office window. Rust above the wheel wells, cracked rear bumper, bed full of everything Caleb still owned. He unlocked the passenger door. Scout jumped in. Caleb stood there with the mountain wind pushing against his jacket and looked at the brass key one more time. Then he looked west. Clouds covered the distant peaks. Somewhere beneath them stood a cabin nobody wanted. For the first time in 11 nights, Caleb knew where he and Scout would sleep next. He just didn't know why Frank Brooks had gone to such trouble to make certain that place belonged to him. By noon, Livingston was 30 miles behind them. By 1, Caleb's phone had lost service. The paved county road narrowed to gravel. Then the gravel gave way to an old logging road that climbed west through ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. October had already touched the high country. Snow remained in the shadows beneath fallen timber, thin white strips where sunlight couldn't reach. Caleb drove slowly. The Ford complained at every washboard rut. Scout sat upright beside him, nose occasionally lifting toward the cracked passenger window. Caleb had printed the county map before leaving town. Sarah's directions were written beneath it. 6 miles past the abandoned cattle guard, left at the burned snag. Cross the drainage. Stay right where the logging road forks. Simple enough on paper. The mountains made it less simple. A section of road had slumped toward a ravine, leaving barely enough room for the truck. Caleb stopped 20 yards short, got out, and walked it first. Scout followed. Stay. The shepherd stopped immediately. Caleb crouched at the damaged shoulder and pressed his boot into the gravel. The outer edge crumbled and bounced down the slope. Bad ground. He looked uphill, then downhill, then behind him. Turnaround point, 70 yards back. Possible bypass through the trees, none. If snow blocked this road later, getting out could become a problem. His mind cataloged the information without invitation. High ground to the north, drainage below, one vehicle approach, limited visibility around the next bend. It was the same old habit. Understand the ground before the ground decided something for you. Caleb returned to the truck and eased across with the driver's tires close to the uphill bank. 10 minutes later, they reached the fork. The left branch disappeared beneath weeds. The right climbed sharply. Scout's ears rose. What? The dog stared into the trees. Caleb killed the engine. Silence rushed in. No traffic, no machinery. Just wind moving through pine needles and the faint knocking of a dead branch somewhere above them. Then Caleb heard water. Far below. A creek. He stored that away too. They continued. The cabin appeared so suddenly, Caleb drove past the entrance. He backed up. A pair of leaning wooden posts marked what had once been a driveway. Beyond them, brown grass climbed toward a small clearing beneath tall pines. And there it was. The photograph from Sarah's office had been generous. The porch steps had collapsed completely on one side. Moss covered almost half the roof. One window was boarded over, another cloudy with grime. The stovepipe leaned several degrees away from the cabin, and a section of gutter hung from one corner like a broken arm. Caleb turned off the Ford. Neither he nor Scout moved. Well. Scout looked at him. Don't say it. The dog jumped out. Caleb followed. Cold air hit him immediately. Not truck stop cold. Mountain cold. Cleaner. Sharper. It carried pine resin, damp earth, and the faint mineral smell of snow. Caleb walked around the cabin before touching the door. Habit again. Exterior first. He found no fresh tire tracks, no broken locks, no obvious animal entry larger than a squirrel hole beneath the rear siding. The roof was bad but not collapsed. That mattered. The north wall leaned slightly. That didn't necessarily matter. The chimney needed attention before he trusted a fire. That mattered a great deal. Scout disappeared around the back. Scout. The shepherd returned almost immediately, carrying something gray in his mouth. Caleb stared. It was a dead work glove. Great. Already furnishing the place. Scout dropped it. Caleb almost smiled. Almost. He climbed onto what remained of the porch and pushed the brass key into the lock. It resisted once. He worked it gently. The mechanism turned. The door opened inward with a long wooden groan. The smell came first. Dust, old wood, mouse droppings, cold ashes, and something faintly familiar Caleb couldn't place. The cabin consisted of one main room, a small kitchen area, and a narrow bedroom in back. Furniture sat beneath canvas covers. A cast-iron wood stove occupied one corner. Frank's old survey maps were gone, but pale rectangles remained on the walls where frames had once hung. Caleb stood just inside. Scout moved past him, nose working. Easy. The dog checked the room methodically, moving along walls, beneath the table, past the bedroom doorway. Caleb noticed it. Scout had learned Caleb's habits too. When Scout returned without concern, Caleb set down his duffel. He spent the next hour inspecting. The porch looked terrible. The siding looked worse, but beneath the cabin, things changed. Caleb crawled through a narrow access opening with a flashlight between his teeth. The piers were stone and concrete, solid. The main beams showed age but little rot. Several joists had been reinforced. Not recently, but professionally. He pressed a screwdriver against the darkest section. The wood resisted. Frank had let the outside go, but underneath, where damage mattered most, he'd maintained it. Caleb backed out. Scout was waiting. This place is lying about itself. The shepherd tilted his head. Yeah. Sounds familiar. By late afternoon, Caleb had cleared mouse nests, opened the windows, swept the floor, and temporarily covered the worst gap near the boarded window. He found dry split wood beneath a tarp behind the cabin. Frank again. The stack was old but protected. Caleb inspected the stovepipe before using it. The exterior section leaned because one support bracket had failed, but the interior pipe remained seated. He cleaned what he could reach, checked the draft, and built the smallest fire possible. Smoke rose correctly. The cabin began to warm. Then the gunshot came, one sharp crack from across the valley. Caleb was on the ground, beside the ford, before the echo returned. His shoulder struck gravel. His eyes searched the tree line. Distance. Direction. Cover. Where was Scout? Scout! The dog emerged from behind the cabin. Caleb's pulse hammered against his throat. Another shot echoed, farther than it sounded. Hunting rifle, probably across the drainage. Montana. October. Hunting season. Caleb knew all of that. His body hadn't waited for the explanation. Scout came directly to him and pressed his shoulder against Caleb's leg. Caleb remained crouched. His right hand had gone to his waist again. Nothing there. Only his belt. Not here, he whispered. Scout stayed against him. Caleb put one hand on the dog's back. The trembling stopped eventually. Not Scout's. His. Night arrived early behind the mountains. Caleb heated canned stew on the wood stove and shared a piece of beef with Scout. The cabin looked different in firelight. Smaller, less abandoned. The old pine walls glowed amber. Shadows moved across the ceiling beams. Caleb spread his sleeping bag beside the stove while Scout circled twice and settled near the door. For a while there was peace, too. Then the wind rose. Something metallic struck the outside wall. Clang. Caleb's eyes opened. Silence, clang. He sat up. The sound came irregularly. Clang. Pause, clang, clang. His chest tightened. For one instant there was no cabin. There was darkness inside an armored vehicle. Dust floating in red light. Metal vibrating under impact. Someone ahead saying something he couldn't hear. Then a white flash existed behind his eyes without existing in the room. Caleb stood too quickly. The cabin returned. Wood stove, sleeping bag, Scout, Montana. He grabbed the flashlight and went outside. The beam found the problem near the roofline. A loose strip of metal flashing. Wind lifted it. Clang. Dropped it. Clang. Caleb stared at it. Such a small thing. He found a ladder behind the woodshed, climbed high enough to reach the loose edge, and secured it temporarily with 2 screws from his toolbox. When he came back inside, Scout was standing exactly where Caleb had left him, watching, just flashing. Scout followed him to the stove. Caleb lay down again. Sleep didn't come. At 3:17, he stopped trying. He sat with his back against the wall and added 1 piece of wood to the fire. Outside, wind moved over the roof without the metallic oodar now. The cabin creaked occasionally as old timber adjusted to the cold. Scout crossed the room and lowered himself beside Caleb. His head settled across Caleb's boot. Caleb looked around. 1 broken chair. A table scarred by decades of use. Dust still hiding in the corners. A roof that needed work. A window covered in plywood. $47 wouldn't have fixed much in a place like this. Caleb didn't have much more than that himself, but the foundation was sound. The stove worked. There was firewood. There was water somewhere in the valley. And nobody had knocked on the window telling him he couldn't stay. He rubbed Scout behind one ear. At least nobody can make us leave tomorrow. Scout's eyes remained closed. Caleb stared into the fire. For the first time in weeks, he felt something loosen inside his chest. Not safety. He wasn't sure he remembered what safety felt like, but maybe this was the beginning of it. Then Scout's head lifted. His ears turned toward the north wall. Caleb stopped moving. The dog stared beyond the cabin, toward the dark ridge behind the trees. He didn't bark. He listened. After several seconds, Scout lowered his head again. Caleb looked toward the window. Nothing was there. Only black forest and the faint reflection of the fire. Still, before lying down, Caleb reached for Frank's property map. He unfolded it beside the stove. The cabin sat near the center of a tiny 1.7-acre rectangle. Caleb studied the northern boundary. Then he looked toward the wall Scout had been watching. Tomorrow, he decided, they would walk the property line. Morning came pale and cold. Frost silvered the grass around the cabin, and a thin skin of ice had formed inside the lower corners of the windows. Caleb woke before sunrise. Not because he'd slept enough, but because a pine cone struck the roof and his body snapped awake before his mind caught up. His hand went to his waist. Empty. Scout lifted his head from beside the stove. Caleb looked at him. Yeah, I know. Scout yawned. By 7, Caleb had coffee boiling and Frank's property map spread across the table. The parcel looked almost ridiculous on paper. 1.7 acres, roughly rectangular, with the cabin near the southern half and the northern boundary cutting through forest. Caleb folded the map into his jacket. They spent the morning working. He replaced 2 rotten porch boards with lumber salvaged from behind the shed, patched a gap near the kitchen window, and removed a mouse nest from an upper cabinet. Scout wandered around the clearing, occasionally returning with pine cones, sticks, and once the bleached vertebra of something Caleb chose not to identify. Around noon, Scout disappeared behind the cabin. Caleb kept working. 5 minutes passed. Scout. Nothing. Caleb set down the hammer. He whistled. A distant bark answered from uphill. Caleb found Scout nearly 200 yards into the trees. The shepherd stood beside an uprooted ponderosa on the north-facing ridge, front paws muddy, nose pressed against packed soil beneath the exposed roots. "What did you find?" Scout scratched again. Dirt scattered backward. Caleb crouched. Probably a ground squirrel. Maybe an old bone. He reached into the loose soil and felt metal. He stopped. Using his fingers, he cleared several inches of earth. A dull, circular cap appeared. Not a pipe, not trash. Caleb brushed away the remaining dirt. Stamped letters emerged beneath the corrosion. Brooks. Below that, Tract 14, and beneath it, Caleb stared. He took Frank's property map from his jacket. The modern survey description didn't call the land Tract 14, and this location made even less sense. According to the map, they should already have been beyond Caleb's northern boundary. He stood and looked back through the trees. The cabin was barely visible. That's interesting. Scout sniffed the cap again. Caleb photographed it from several angles, then placed his compass flat over the metal. Old habits returned. Don't assume. Observe first. He took a bearing toward the cabin, then another along the ridge. That's when he noticed the tree. An old ponderosa 20 yards west carried a scar in its bark. Not random damage. 2 diagonal cuts, weathered nearly smooth by decades of growth. Caleb walked to it. Another tree farther west carried a similar mark, then another. Blazes, old boundary marks. He followed them carefully. The line extended west through the forest, far beyond what his little county map suggested belonged to Frank's cabin. Caleb stopped. Something was wrong. Either the marker had been moved, the map was incomplete, or this survey had nothing to do with the property he'd inherited. But Frank Brooks had been a county surveyor. Surveyors didn't usually bury stamped monuments for decoration. Caleb looked at Scout. "You didn't smell land records, did you?" Scout panted. "No. Didn't think so." The dog had probably caught the scent of some animal that had dug around the exposed roots, but that didn't make the metal beneath those roots less real. Caleb photographed the blazes. He didn't disturb the marker further. Then they continued along the ridge. 50 yards later, Scout stopped again. Not sniffing this time. Listening. His entire posture changed. Tail still, mouth closed, ears forward. Caleb froze. Scout stared downhill. Caleb heard nothing at first. Then a faint sound reached him. A vehicle. Far away. Engine climbing. Then fading. Could have been a hunter. Could have been somebody on another logging road. Caleb checked his watch. 12:46. He stored the time without knowing why. They walked another quarter mile before Caleb turned back. He wanted tools from the cabin before investigating farther. Scout moved ahead, weaving between trees. As they descended, Caleb found himself looking for more marks. There were several, some nearly swallowed by bark, others unmistakable once he knew what to look for. A line. Always a line. The cabin appeared through the trees. Scout suddenly stopped. Caleb nearly walked into him. What? Scout lowered his nose. Fresh tracks crossed the trail. Bootprints. Caleb crouched. His own boots had deep horizontal tread blocks, worn heavily along the outside heel. These were different, narrower, chevron pattern. One print lay directly over Caleb's morning track. Recent. He looked toward the cabin. No movement. The truck remained where he'd parked it. Caleb's breathing changed. Not faster. Quieter. He scanned the windows. Door. Woodshed. Tree line. He moved left instead of approaching directly, using the rise behind the cabin to see the clearing from an angle. Scout stayed close. With me. The shepherd obeyed. Caleb waited. 30 seconds. A minute. Nothing moved. He circled toward the truck. No broken glass. No obvious damage. The cabin door was shut. Caleb remembered locking it. He checked the ground. More prints. Someone had come from the logging road, crossed near the woodshed, approached the porch, then returned. Caleb touched the doorknob. Locked. He used the brass key. Inside, the room appeared untouched. Chair, table, coffee cup, tools, sleeping bag. Scout moved through the cabin with his nose low. Caleb checked the bedroom. Nothing. Then the kitchen. Nothing. Finally, the old desk beneath the boarded window. Caleb stopped. The top drawer was open. Not much. Less than an inch. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Caleb did. He remembered closing it because the swollen wood had required pressure from his thumb. Inside were Sarah's estate papers, the modern property description, and the tax documents she'd given him. Nothing seemed missing. Caleb didn't touch them. Scout sniffed the drawer, then the floor, then the edge of the desk. Caleb walked to the window. Through a gap beside the plywood, he could see the northern ridge. His eyes moved from the cabin to the tree line, to the direction of the survey marker. Someone had entered. Maybe they'd used a key. Maybe the old lock could be manipulated easily. But whoever it was hadn't taken Caleb's toolbox, hadn't taken the emergency cash inside his duffel, hadn't taken anything he could see. They had looked at his property papers. Caleb finally closed the drawer. This time he pushed until the wood seated firmly. Scout watched him. Could be Frank had another key somewhere. The words sounded reasonable. Caleb didn't believe them. That afternoon, he repaired the porch without going back to the ridge. He also moved Frank's map from the desk into his truck. At sunset, Caleb stood near the woodpile while Scout patrolled the edge of the clearing. The mountain had seemed empty yesterday. Now it felt occupied. Caleb hated that feeling. In Afghanistan, empty places had rarely been empty once somebody began paying attention to them. He forced the comparison away. This was Montana. Not an AO, no patrol, no mission, just an old cabin, an old survey marker, and somebody's footprints. Scout suddenly looked uphill. Caleb followed his gaze. The ridge was dark beneath the trees. He thought about the stamped words beneath the ponderosa. Brooks, Tract 14, NE Corner. Then he thought about Sarah telling him Frank had specifically forbidden the cabin from going to another heir while Caleb was alive. Those two facts had been strange separately. Together, they bothered him. Caleb took out his phone and opened the photographs. He enlarged the survey cap until the letters filled the screen. Tomorrow, he would drive into town. If Tract 14 had ever existed, somebody at the county office might know what it was. And if it had nothing to do with his cabin, Caleb wanted to hear that too. Scout returned from the tree line and sat beside him. Caleb rested one hand on the dog's neck. For 11 nights, his biggest problem had been finding a place where nobody could tell him to move along. Now he had one. And less than 24 hours after arriving, somebody had already come looking through it. Caleb left for town shortly after sunrise. He took the photographs of the survey marker, but not the original estate papers. Those stayed inside a plastic envelope beneath the spare tire compartment of his truck. It wasn't much of a hiding place, but after yesterday, he wasn't leaving every piece of information in one drawer. Scout rode beside him, watching the forest slide past the window. The road down from the cabin twisted between steep slopes covered in ponderosa and lodgepole pine. Overnight frost still clung to the shadows. Twice Caleb slowed where loose rock had fallen across the road, automatically studying the uphill side before passing beneath it. 40 minutes later, pavement appeared. The county offices occupied a low brick building beside the courthouse in a town small enough that 3 blocks of storefronts made up most of downtown. Caleb left the truck windows cracked for Scout and stepped inside. The mapping department was downstairs. A woman in her late 30s sat behind 2 computer monitors surrounded by rolled maps, survey books, and a coffee mug that read, GIS, where is your problem? Her nameplate said, Megan Price. Caleb placed his phone on the counter. I'm trying to figure out what this is. Megan enlarged the photograph. Her expression changed when she read the stamp. Where'd you find it? Near a cabin I inherited. Did you move it? No. Good. That answer seemed to earn him something. She asked for the parcel number. Caleb gave it to her. Within minutes, a modern aerial image appeared on one monitor. The cabin parcel was outlined in yellow, a tiny shape pressed against a much larger patchwork of timberland. Megan entered the stamped words into an older index. Nothing. She tried another database, then another. Caleb stood quietly. He had learned years ago that people often revealed more when you didn't crowd the silence. Finally, Megan leaned closer to the screen. Here. A scanned index card appeared. Brooks Ridge Survey. Reference, Tract 14. Caleb felt something tighten beneath his ribs. Can you pull the survey? Maybe. She searched the document number. No digital image. Then the plat reference. Nothing. Megan frowned. That's odd. What? The index says there was a physical filing. And? The archive location is incomplete. Caleb looked at the screen. So the survey existed. The reference existed. That's not the same as proving what land it covered. She pointed toward the photograph. But that cap looks consistent with markers from that period. Caleb nodded. No excitement. Not yet. What should I do? Don't dig up anything else. Photograph whatever you find. Get locations if you can. And if this turns into an ownership question, you'll want a licensed surveyor and an attorney. I've got the attorney. Megan gave him a curious look. That's usually the part people wait too long to do. Caleb almost smiled. Wasn't my choice. Before leaving, he wrote Megan's office number on the back of a gas receipt. Scout was standing in the truck when Caleb returned. Not sitting. Standing. Looking across the street. Caleb followed his gaze. Nothing unusual. A pickup at the gas station. 2 men outside a hardware store. A delivery van. Still, Scout rarely stood like that without a reason. Caleb opened the door. What have you got? Scout sniffed the air and settled. By the time they reached the mountain road again, clouds had begun collecting above the western ridges. Caleb spent the drive thinking about one thing. Tract 14 had existed on paper. At least once. That didn't make it his, but it meant the marker wasn't meaningless. When the cabin clearing came into view, another truck was parked beside the porch. Black. Clean. Too clean for that road. Luke Brooks leaned against the driver's door. Scout gave a low sound. "Easy," Caleb said. He parked 15 feet away. Luke smiled. "Was wondering when you'd get back." Caleb stepped out. "How'd you know I was gone?" The smile held. "Saw your truck wasn't here." Caleb didn't ask where Luke had been standing when he'd seen that. Scout jumped down and remained beside Caleb. Luke looked around the clearing. "Place hasn't improved much. I've had 2 days. Still 2 days too many." Luke laughed at his own joke. Caleb didn't. Luke walked toward the porch. His boots were expensive hunting boots, dark leather above the ankles, but the soles and lower edges were coated with pale gray-brown clay. Caleb looked once, then away. The soil around the cabin was nearly black with decaying needles. The north ridge was different. Exposed clay beneath shallow forest soil. The same clay Caleb had brushed from the survey cap. Luke stopped beside the porch. "I've been thinking. That sounds expensive." Luke laughed again, but this time it came slower. "Maybe I was hard on you at Sarah's office." Caleb waited. "You need money. I want a hunting place. You have hunting land. I want more." Luke gestured toward the cabin. "I'll give you 18,000. Caleb looked at him. "For this?" "For the parcel. The building's assessed at $1. Then you're getting a pretty good deal." Scout moved forward one step as Luke came closer. Not lunging, not growling, simply placing himself between them. Luke glanced down. "Still dragging that dog everywhere?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Scout goes where I go. Suit yourself." Luke shoved his hands into his jacket. 18,000. Cash deal. Sarah can handle the paperwork." Caleb let 3 seconds pass. "No." Luke blinked. 25. Caleb said nothing. 30. That was the moment. Not the number, the speed. Luke had added $12,000 in less than 30 seconds for a ruined cabin he'd mocked days earlier. Caleb looked toward the woodshed as though considering it. In the corner of his vision, he watched Luke. Luke wasn't looking at the cabin. He was looking uphill, toward the north ridge. Caleb felt the old part of his mind begin assembling pieces. The open drawer, the bootprints, the missing archive entry, the clay. Luke's offer. None of it proved anything. But patterns didn't need to be proof before they became warnings. In Afghanistan, Caleb had learned that an object out of place mattered less than the behavior around it. A road could look empty. A doorway could look ordinary. Sometimes the anomaly was simply the person who refused to look at what everyone else was watching. Caleb kept his voice casual. "I'll think about it." Luke turned back. "You will?" "Didn't say yes, but you'll consider it." "Sure." Luke studied him. For the first time, the easy confidence seemed forced. "Don't wait too long. Winter's coming. Roof caves in, you'll have nothing." Caleb glanced at the cabin. "Then I guess I'd better fix the roof." Luke's smile disappeared. Only for a moment. He walked toward his truck. Scout remained motionless. Luke opened the door, then stopped. "Frank ever tell you anything about this place?" Caleb looked at him. "Like what?" "Nothing. Just curious." "No." That part was almost true. Frank had never told Caleb anything useful about the cabin. Luke nodded, then drove away. Caleb watched the truck descend the logging road until the engine faded. Scout immediately turned toward the ridge. "Not today," Caleb crouched beside him and examined the dog's paws, mostly to give his hands something ordinary to do. $30,000. 2 weeks ago, that amount would have looked enormous. It could have paid debts, put him in an apartment, replaced the truck, bought time. But Luke hadn't offered $30,000 because he felt sorry for him. Caleb stood and walked to where Luke had been leaning. A small chunk of dried clay had fallen from his boot. Caleb picked it up, pale, powdery. He carried it toward the porch and compared it with the dirt still trapped in the tread of his own boots from yesterday's climb. Almost identical. Scout sniffed it. Caleb dropped it. Yeah. The wind shifted. Far above them, clouds thickened over the ridge. Caleb unlocked the cabin. Before entering, he turned and studied the tree line. Luke knew something. Maybe about Tract 14. Maybe about Frank. Maybe only about the value of the land. But Caleb understood one thing now. Whoever had entered the cabin hadn't been searching for money, and Luke Brooks had just offered $30,000 for a $1 building without asking to see inside it. The storm arrived before dark. It came over the western ridge as a solid wall of gray, swallowing the upper slopes first and then dropping into the valley. Wind bent the ponderosas until their tops moved like waves. Caleb had just carried the last armload of firewood onto the porch when the rain began. Scout hurried inside. "Smartest one here," Caleb muttered. Within 20 minutes, water hammered the tin roof hard enough to drown out the stove. Caleb placed 2 pots beneath leaks and checked the patched window. The cabin smelled of wet wood, coffee, and old pine smoke. It wasn't comfortable, but it was dry enough. That counted. Then lightning turned the windows white. The thunder came almost on top of it. Caleb stopped moving. Another flash. For a fraction of a second, the cabin disappeared. There was only a road. Dust hanging over tan earth, a vehicle ahead, a white burst beneath it, pressure, someone yelling. "Contact!" Caleb was on the floor before he understood why. His shoulder struck the table. A metal cup rolled across the boards. The sound pulled something deeper loose. He could smell hot rubber, diesel, burned dust. Except none of those smells were in the cabin. Rain was, wood smoke was, Scout was. The shepherd pushed against Caleb's chest, one paw scraping his jacket. Caleb blinked. The floorboards returned beneath him. Montana. Cabin. Storm. He pressed both palms flat against the wood. "Here," he whispered. Scout stayed against him. "I'm here." Thunder rolled away through the valley. Caleb sat up slowly. His coffee had spilled. He stared at it spreading across the floor. Years ago, he'd been able to hear explosions and keep moving because everyone around him needed him to. Now a Montana thunderstorm could put him on a floor before his brain understood there was no convoy to save. That thought hurt more than his shoulder. He cleaned the coffee. Scout followed him from one side of the room to the other. "I'm fine." Scout stared. "You're getting judgmental." The dog's tail moved once. Near 9, the storm worsened. Caleb checked the back wall with his flashlight. Rainwater was running downhill toward the cabin, collecting near the foundation. He found an old shovel and went outside. Cold water soaked him instantly. He cut a shallow drainage channel to divert runoff around the rear corner. Scout remained beneath the porch roof until Caleb ordered him inside. By the time Caleb returned, his hands were numb. He stripped off his wet jacket and hung it beside the stove. Scout wasn't watching him. The dog stood beside Frank's built-in wooden bench along the north wall, sniffing. "What's there?" Scout scratched the floor. "Mouse?" Scratch. Scout. The shepherd pushed his nose beneath the bench and pawed harder. Caleb sighed. "All right." The bench had been built directly against the wall. Heavy pine. Old square nails. Caleb removed the seat first. Nothing. Scout immediately pushed his nose into the corner beneath it. Caleb aimed the flashlight. 2 floorboards were different from the others. Same age. Same stain. But the nail heads were less corroded. Caleb crouched. Frank. He slipped a pry bar beneath the first board. It resisted, then lifted with a groan. Cold earth showed beneath. Scout became more excited. The second board came free. Caleb shined the light into the opening. Something cylindrical lay under the dirt. He reached down. Metal. A rusted survey tube. For several seconds, Caleb simply held it. Then he carried it to the table. Scout sat beside him. The cap had been sealed with old wax. Caleb worked it loose carefully. Inside was a bundle wrapped in waxed cloth. He unfolded it. A field notebook appeared. Frank Brooks. The handwriting inside was small and precise. Dates, bearings, distances, monument numbers. Caleb turned pages slowly. Several entries referenced Tract 14. He stopped. The same designation stamped into the survey cap. More bearings followed. Lines extending far beyond the cabin parcel. Then one sentence had been written twice. Original deed secured separately. Caleb turned the page. Below a set of coordinates was another note. Never leave deed and field book together. The rain struck the roof. Caleb read the sentence again. Frank hadn't simply stored records. He'd separated them deliberately. Why? Thunder rolled across the valley. Scout suddenly stood. His head turned toward the back wall. Caleb looked up. What? Scout barked. Once. Sharp. Caleb listened. Beneath the storm came another sound. A low grinding noise. Rock against rock. Scout ran toward the door. Caleb grabbed his flashlight. Outside, water poured across the clearing. He moved around the cabin. The beam caught muddy water streaming down the rear slope. Then a small tree tilted. Caleb froze. The ground beneath it was moving. Scout! Back! The hillside gave a deep, wet crack. Caleb's body reacted before thought. He moved laterally, away from the fall line. Scout! With me! A section of saturated earth broke loose. Mud, branches, and rocks slid downhill. Caleb ran toward the side clearing. Scout followed. A dead pine snapped somewhere above them. The noise vanished inside the storm. Caleb reached higher ground near a rock outcrop. Scout! No dog. He turned. Scout was behind him near the woodshed. The shepherd had stopped suddenly. Then Caleb heard the yelp. Scout! He ran back. A sheet of rusted roofing lay hidden beneath brush, probably blown from an old outbuilding years earlier. Scout's front paw had come down on its jagged edge. Blood washed pink through the rain. Caleb dropped to his knees. Easy. Easy. Scout tried to stand. No. Another rumble came from the slope. Caleb slid one arm beneath Scout's chest and the other under his hindquarters. 70 pounds. His old shoulder screamed. He lifted anyway. The dog trembled against him. Caleb carried Scout uphill. Behind them, mud struck the rear corner of the woodshed and pushed loose boards sideways. They reached the truck. Caleb opened the passenger door and placed Scout inside. The paw was bleeding heavily, but the cut appeared confined to the pad and side of the foot. Caleb pulled the first aid kit from behind the seat. Gauze. Clean water. Bandage. His fingers moved automatically. Pressure first. Check the wound. Control bleeding. Wrap. Recheck. Scout's breathing was fast. So's mine, Caleb said. He kept his voice low. Stay with me. The words came out before he could stop them. For one terrible second, they belonged to another place, another wounded man, another night. Caleb's hands paused. Scout pushed his nose against his wrist. Caleb swallowed. Not you. He finished the bandage. They remained in the truck until the worst of the slope movement stopped. Near midnight, Caleb carried Scout back inside. The cabin still stood. Mud had piled against part of the rear foundation, but the main slide had passed several yards behind it. Caleb placed Scout beside the stove on his sleeping bag. The shepherd tried to rise. You're done for tonight. Scout lowered himself reluctantly. Caleb sat beside him. The field notebook remained open on the table. The storm had given him two things he hadn't expected. One was evidence that Frank had known about Tract 14. The other was a reminder that the mountain could kill without caring who owned a single acre of it. Caleb changed Scout's bandage when blood spotted through the first layer. The dog didn't pull away. He only watched Caleb's face. Outside, rain softened to a steady whisper. Caleb rubbed the fur behind Scout's ear. I've got you. Scout's eyes slowly closed. Caleb remained awake. At 2:41, he checked the paw again. At 3:08, he checked the hillside through the window. At 3:36, he returned to Frank's notebook. Original deed secured separately. Never leave deed and field book together. Caleb stared at the words until the lantern flame trembled. Someone had already searched the cabin. Luke suddenly wanted the property, and Frank had deliberately hidden one piece of the truth while placing another somewhere else. Caleb looked toward Scout sleeping beside the stove, his white bandage bright against the dark floor. The $1 cabin no longer felt like an inheritance nobody wanted. It felt like something Frank had spent years making sure the wrong person never understood. By morning, the storm had moved east. Clouds still hung low between the ridges, but sunlight broke through in narrow strips, turning wet pine trunks almost black. Behind the cabin, the slide had carved a brown scar through the forest. Caleb stood at its edge with a mug of coffee and studied the damage. The cabin had been lucky. Scout had been less so. The shepherd limped when he tried to follow Caleb outside. No. Caleb pointed toward the porch. Scout stopped. You're on light duty. Scout stared at him. Caleb knew that look. I don't care what rank you think you are. The dog lowered himself onto the porch with a long sigh. Caleb almost smiled. Then he looked toward the north ridge. Not today. Scout's paw needed proper care, and Frank's notebook had already given Caleb more than enough to investigate. Before leaving, Caleb photographed every page. He worked slowly, placing the notebook beside a ruler and photographing each sheet in daylight. He copied the images to an old memory card, sealed the original notebook in a plastic bag, and hid it beneath loose insulation inside the cabin wall. After the opened drawer, carrying the only copy around felt foolish. Scout rode in the truck with his injured paw resting on a folded blanket. At the veterinary clinic, the cut proved deep but clean. No tendon damage, no broken bone. The veterinarian flushed it, applied a stronger dressing, and told Caleb to keep Scout from running on it. Caleb looked at Scout. Scout looked at Caleb. The veterinarian laughed. Good luck. An hour later, they were at the county offices. Megan Price pulled a chair beside her desk when she saw Scout's bandage. What happened? Mountain won an argument. Scout settled carefully at Caleb's boots. Caleb showed Megan the photographs. Her expression sharpened as she moved through the pages. These are field notes. Frank's. I can see that. She enlarged one photograph. Bearing, distance, monument. Another page. Same thing. Caleb pointed toward repeated references to Tract 14. Can you tell where those lines go? Not accurately from this alone. But roughly? Megan hesitated. Roughly. She opened the county mapping system. For the next hour, they worked through Frank's bearings one by one. Caleb read. Megan plotted. The first line extended west. The second turned south. Then east, then north again. The shape grew. Caleb watched it spread across the modern map, past his cabin, past the ridge, across forest, down into the narrow valley. Megan stopped typing. Neither spoke. How big? Caleb finally asked. She selected a measurement tool. The number appeared. Approximately 640 acres. Caleb stared at it. 1 square mile. He leaned back. That can't be right. Maybe it isn't. Frank's cabin parcel is 1.7. I know. Megan switched between layers. Historic aerial imagery, modern parcels, roads, timber holdings. The old lines didn't match the current ownership map cleanly. Large portions of the area were now shown under other parcels. One name appeared repeatedly. North Star Timber and Land. Caleb felt the excitement drain away. If these notes are right, how does somebody else own it? That's not a GIS question. Megan's voice was careful. Maps show recorded information. They don't decide title disputes, so this proves nothing. It proves Frank surveyed something. She tapped the screen. And that your marker appears consistent with his notes. But it doesn't prove he owned 640 acres. No. Caleb nodded. That answer made sense. He trusted it more because it wasn't what he wanted to hear. They printed nothing. Caleb photographed the screen instead. Outside, Scout limped toward the truck. The distance was less than 50 yards, but halfway there, the shepherd slowed. Caleb stopped. Scout tried another step. No. Caleb crouched and slid one arm beneath the dog's chest. His shoulder protested immediately. He lifted anyway. 70 pounds of German shepherd settled against him. You tell anybody about this? I'll deny it. Scout's ears moved. By the time Caleb reached the truck, pain burned from his shoulder into his neck. He placed Scout gently on the seat. For a moment, Caleb remained bent over, breathing through his nose. Old injury, old body, too many miles. Scout licked his wrist. I'm charging you rent. From the county office, Caleb drove directly to Sarah Whitman's law office. She closed the door when he showed her the photographs. Unlike Megan, Sarah didn't react to the acreage first. She reacted to the phrase original deed secured separately. Where's the notebook? Safe. Meaning? Safe. Sarah looked at him for a second. Good. She examined several pages. Caleb, listen carefully. Field notes are evidence. A monument can be evidence. Neither automatically makes you owner of everything inside those lines. I know. We need chain of title, recorded conveyances, tax records, easements, any transfers after this survey. And if Frank's note is accurate, we need that original deed. What if we find it? Then we find out what it actually says. Caleb appreciated that answer too. No promises, no treasure story. Paper mattered only when other paper agreed with it. Sarah turned toward her computer. North Star Timber and Land. You know them? Everybody dealing with rural property around here knows them. She searched public filings. They've been consolidating timber and access holdings for years. Caleb thought of Luke's clean black truck. What does Luke do for them? Sarah looked up. You said Luke? He offered me $30,000 for the cabin yesterday. Her hands stopped over the keyboard. 30? Started at 18. Sarah searched again. A corporate filing appeared. Then a land transaction. Then another. Luke Brooks wasn't an executive. He was listed through a regional acquisition contractor in several North Star purchases. Caleb stared at the name. Acquisitions. Sarah nodded slowly. Looks that way. The room became quiet. Scout shifted beneath Caleb's chair. Sarah opened a county transaction map and began checking dates. Her expression changed. Caleb. What? North Star purchased this parcel 18 months ago. She pointed. Then another. 14 months. Another. 9. The purchases formed no perfect circle, but the pattern was unmistakable. They surrounded Brooks Ridge from several directions. Caleb leaned closer. How long? Sarah checked another record. Almost 2 years. Luke hadn't suddenly become interested after Frank died. Someone had been interested long before Caleb inherited anything. On the drive home, Caleb said almost nothing. The late afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, laying gold across the mountains. Water glittered in roadside ditches. Steam rose from wet timber. It should have been beautiful. Caleb kept checking the mirror. Once. Then again several miles later. No black truck. No obvious follower. He told himself to stop. This wasn't Afghanistan. Luke wasn't an insurgent. North Star wasn't an enemy force. A land company buying property wasn't a conspiracy. But Caleb had spent enough time around maps to understand terrain. People didn't always need the whole mountain. Sometimes they needed one road, one ridge, one crossing, one narrow piece that connected everything else. At the cabin, Scout tried to jump down. Caleb caught him. No heroics. He carried the dog to the porch. This time, Scout didn't resist. Caleb sat beside him as evening settled over the valley. Somewhere beyond the trees lay a survey marker Frank had placed decades ago. Beyond that were lines in a notebook suggesting 640 acres. Beyond those lines were properties a timber company had been quietly buying for almost 2 years. And somewhere, if Frank's handwriting could be trusted, there was another document. The original deed. Caleb rubbed Scout's neck. For a few hours that morning, 640 acres had sounded like the answer to every problem he'd had. Now it felt like the beginning of a much larger one. The cabin gave a soft creak as the temperature dropped. Scout raised his head toward the woods. Caleb followed his gaze. Nothing moved. Still, he no longer saw empty forest. He saw boundaries, approaches, roads, people who wanted something, and one missing piece of paper that might explain why. Caleb spent the next 2 days doing something that felt almost unnatural. He waited. Scout's injured paw needed time, and Sarah had warned him not to turn suspicion into accusation without evidence. So Caleb worked on the cabin instead. He reinforced the rear drainage channel, replaced another section of damaged roofing, and cut enough firewood to last through the first real snow. But his habits changed. Before leaving for town, he photographed the cabin door. He placed a dry pine needle against the lower corner of the jamb. He left a small piece of bark behind the woodshed, where a tire would crush it if anyone drove around back. Nothing elaborate, nothing that would stop a person. Only things that might tell Caleb whether somebody had been there. Scout watched him work. "Old habits," Caleb said. The shepherd tilted his head. Caleb had learned years ago that security wasn't always a locked door. Sometimes it was knowing what normal looked like so you could recognize when normal had changed. On the third afternoon, they returned from town carrying groceries, roofing nails, and antibiotics for Scout. The cabin looked exactly as they'd left it. Door closed. Windows intact. No vehicle. Caleb reached for the handle. Scout stopped 20 feet away. A low growl came from his chest. Caleb froze. Scout wasn't looking at the cabin. He was looking past it, toward the woodshed. Caleb set the grocery bag down. Stay. Scout remained beside the truck. Caleb didn't approach the door. Instead, he backed toward the uphill side of the clearing and moved through the trees until he could see the cabin from above. Windows, porch, rear wall, woodshed. Nothing. He waited. The forest felt wrong. It took several seconds to understand why. No birds? Usually chickadees move through the branches near the cabin. Jays screamed whenever Scout crossed the clearing. Now there was only wind. Caleb studied the ground. Behind the woodshed, the piece of bark he'd placed was broken. A tire impression cut through damp soil. Fresh. His jaw tightened. He circled wide and approached the cabin from the side. The pine needle at the door was gone. Caleb unlocked it. Scout entered only after him. The room looked untouched. Again. Caleb checked the stove. Bedroom, kitchen, desk. Cash remained inside his duffel. Tools remained against the wall. The old brass key was where he'd left it. Then he went to the section of wall where he'd hidden Frank's notebook. The insulation had been disturbed. Caleb reached inside. Empty. He didn't move for several seconds. Scout sniffed beneath him. The field notes were gone. Not the cash. Not the tools. Not anything a thief could easily sell. Only Frank's notebook. Caleb stepped outside. His eyes moved toward the ridge. Someone knew exactly what they wanted now. He called Deputy Ben Carter. Ben arrived an hour later in a county sheriff's SUV coated with mountain road mud. He was broad-shouldered, gray beginning at his temples, with the patient manner of a man who had spent years listening to neighbors argue over fences. He photographed the tire mark, then the disturbed wall. Any idea who'd want survey notes? Yes. Ben looked up. Can you prove it? No. Then give me the name and I'll document it as information, not fact. Luke Brooks. Ben wrote it down. Caleb told him about the purchase offer. The clay on Luke's boots. North Star. The earlier footprints. Ben listened without interrupting. When Caleb finished, the deputy closed his notebook. Change the lock. I will. And don't confront anybody. I wasn't planning to. Ben looked at him for a moment. You were military? Army. Figured. Caleb's expression hardened slightly. Why? Because you've checked the tree line 6 times since I got here. Caleb hadn't realized he'd been doing it. Ben didn't smile. Being careful is fine. Just remember where you are. Caleb looked toward the mountains. I keep trying. By nightfall, Ben was gone. Caleb installed a new deadbolt using screws long enough to bite into the wall framing. Then he moved his remaining documents into the truck. The photographs of Frank's notebook still existed. That mattered. Whoever had stolen the original hadn't erased what Caleb knew, but they had crossed a line. At 11:43, Scout woke. No bark, just instant alertness. Caleb opened his eyes. The shepherd stood beside the door. His injured paw barely touched the floor. Caleb listened. Wind, stove, a branch brushing the roof. Then darkness outside flashed white. Once, gone. Not lightning, too small. A flashlight. Caleb was out of bed. He pulled on his boots without turning on the lantern. Scout, stay. The dog followed anyway. Caleb opened the back door and stepped into the cold. The flashlight appeared again between the trees. Higher ground. North side. Someone was there. Hey! The light vanished. Movement followed. Fast. branches snapping. Caleb climbed toward the ridge, keeping trees between himself and the sound. Scout surged ahead. "Scout! Heel!" The shepherd ignored him. "Scout!" A dark shape moved between the pines. Then Scout disappeared into brush. Caleb heard a crash. A sharp canine cry tore through the night. His stomach dropped. "Scout!" He ran. The flashlight was already retreating toward the logging road. Caleb could hear someone moving downhill. He didn't follow. Not anymore. "Scout!" He found the shepherd 30 yards ahead. Scout lay tangled beside an old fence line, almost invisible beneath dead grass and snowberry brush. Barbed wire, probably decades old. One strand had caught his shoulder. Blood darkened the fur. Caleb dropped beside him. "Don't move!" Scout tried to rise. "Down!" This time he obeyed. Caleb pulled his flashlight. The cut ran along the upper shoulder, where the wire had opened the skin as Scout forced through. Caleb's hands went cold for reasons that had nothing to do with the temperature. Blood on fur. Dark ground. Fast breathing. For 1 second, another image tried to replace the mountain. A road outside Ghazni. Dust. A torn uniform. A voice saying they needed a medic. Caleb shut his eyes. Not there. Here. Scout. Montana. He opened them. "You're with me." He took gauze from the small kit he had started carrying after Scout's paw injury and pressed it against the wound. Scout whined. "I know." Caleb's voice cracked. "I know, buddy." The footsteps in the distance disappeared. Caleb didn't care. He kept pressure on the shoulder until the bleeding slowed. Then he cut the old wire away from Scout's fur with the multi-tool in his pocket. The dog tried to stand again. No. Caleb slid his arms beneath him. His damaged shoulder protested immediately. He lifted. Pain shot through his neck. He kept moving. Scout rested his head against Caleb's chest. The walk back seemed twice as long. Caleb stopped once against a tree, breathing hard. "You've got 4 legs," he whispered. "This arrangement isn't fair." Scout licked his chin. Caleb laughed once despite himself. It came out close to a sob. At the cabin, he cleaned the wound under lantern light. The cut would need veterinary attention, but it wasn't pouring blood anymore. Scout lay still while Caleb wrapped the shoulder. Outside, the mountain returned to silence. Caleb sat on the floor beside him. He thought about chasing the person with the flashlight. A younger version of himself might have. A version still running on training and anger might have treated the retreating figure like contact and forgotten everything else. But Scout had cried out, and Caleb had chosen him. That choice mattered. He rested his forehead briefly against the shepherd's head. "I'm sorry." Scout's tail tapped the floor. Caleb looked toward the wall where Frank's notebook had been hidden. Someone had entered once and searched his papers. Then someone had returned and stolen the one original record connected to Tract 14. Now someone had come back after dark while Caleb was home. This wasn't curiosity anymore. It wasn't a cousin trying to buy a cheap hunting cabin. Whoever wanted Frank's evidence had stopped waiting for Caleb to leave. And tonight, Scout had bled because of it. By sunrise, the blood on Scout's shoulder had dried nearly black around the bandage. Caleb had not slept. Every few minutes he had checked the wrap, then the window, then Scout's breathing. When the stove burned low, he fed it another split log. When Scout shifted, Caleb's eyes opened even if they had been closed only seconds. At 7, he carried the shepherd to the truck. Scout could walk, but Caleb wouldn't let him. The veterinary clinic opened at 8. The doctor shaved the fur around Scout's shoulder and cleaned the wound. The barbed wire had cut deeply enough to require stitches, but it had missed the major muscle beneath. "He's lucky," the veterinarian said. Caleb stared at the exposed wound. Lucky. He had heard that word in field hospitals. Lucky it missed the artery. Lucky the blast went under the other vehicle. Lucky he was still breathing. Sometimes lucky meant someone had survived. Sometimes it only meant things could have been worse. Scout was sedated for the procedure. Caleb sat on the clinic floor afterward with his back against the wall, ignoring the empty chair beside him. Scout lay on a blanket. His shoulder was shaved, stitched, and covered. Caleb rested one hand beside the dog's nose. As the sedative wore off, Scout's nostrils moved. He smelled Caleb's fingers. His tail made one weak tap. Hey. Another tap. Caleb looked away. On Scout's fur, just beyond the clean bandage, the clinic staff had missed one tiny brown-red stain. Suddenly, Caleb saw another patch of blood. Not fur. Desert camouflage. A young soldier named Eric Walsh lying behind the remains of a concrete wall outside Ghazni. Caleb had been 33. Walsh had been 22. There had been shouting over the radio, dust in the air, and a disabled vehicle blocking the safest approach. Caleb remembered calculating distances while someone kept yelling that Walsh was still alive. He remembered being told to hold position. He remembered obeying. By the time they reached him, there had been nothing left to do. Caleb's thumb began rubbing against his forefinger. Once. Twice. Again. Scout opened his eyes. The dog lifted his head half an inch. Caleb stopped. Easy. Scout lowered his head again. Caleb stayed there until his breathing matched the slow rise and fall of the dog's ribs. Deputy Carter met him outside. Ben had driven up from the sheriff's office after hearing Scout was being treated. We found partial tracks near the logging road, he said. Boot prints and tire impressions. Nothing clean enough to identify anybody. Luke? I talked to him. Caleb waited. He says he was home. Anybody confirm it? His wife. Caleb gave a humorless nod. Ben continued. We don't have enough to tie him to your cabin. Somebody stole Frank's notebook. I know. And somebody was outside last night. I know that too. Caleb looked through the clinic window at Scout. Ben lowered his voice. Knowing and proving aren't the same thing. Caleb said nothing. Don't go hunting for whoever did this. I'm not. Ben watched him carefully. Caleb met his eyes. I'm not. That afternoon, Sarah gave him worse news. Without Frank's original field notebook, the photographs were still useful, but authentication could become harder if the dispute reached court. Without the original deed, they still had no clean explanation for how Tract 14 related to current ownership. We can keep researching, Sarah said. How much? She hesitated. Potentially a lot. I mean money. I know. Caleb leaned back. Sarah folded her hands. Title litigation involving old surveys and competing records can take months, sometimes years. Caleb looked down at his boots. He had less money in the bank than Luke had probably spent on the tires of his truck. Sarah seemed to read the thought. I'm not telling you to quit. You're telling me what it costs not to. I'm telling you the truth. Caleb nodded. He appreciated that. But the truth didn't make Scout's stitches disappear. By late afternoon, snow began falling. Small flakes at first, then larger ones. Caleb drove back to the cabin with Scout sleeping beside him. The road climbed into white silence. When they reached the clearing, Caleb didn't unload the groceries. He went inside and packed. Sleeping bag, clothes, tools, dog food, Frank's photographs. He moved without hesitation. That was how he had always handled a bad position. If the ground couldn't be held without unacceptable risk, you moved. Survival wasn't cowardice. It was judgment. Except this wasn't an LZ. There was no squad, no mission. There was only him and a wounded dog. Caleb looked around the cabin. A week ago, it had been more than he'd had. Tonight, it felt like a trap. He carried the last bag to the truck. Scout watched from the passenger seat. "I'm done." Scout's ears moved. "I should have been done when somebody came through the door." Snow collected on Caleb's shoulders. "I kept pushing because I wanted it to mean something." He looked toward the ridge. Frank's marker. The notebook. 640 acres. He shook his head. "What good is land if I get you killed over it?" Scout stared at him through the open door. Caleb climbed behind the wheel. The engine turned over. Headlights illuminated the cabin. Snow crossed the beams in thick diagonal lines. Caleb placed the truck in reverse. Then Scout moved. The shepherd climbed down from the passenger seat. "Scout." He landed awkwardly. His injured shoulder nearly folded beneath him. "Scout!" Caleb killed the engine and jumped out. The dog limped toward the trees. "Stop!" Scout continued. "Scout, heel." Nothing. Caleb caught up and blocked him. Scout turned around Caleb and kept going. "You've got stitches." The shepherd's nose stayed low. "Scout!" Caleb grabbed his collar. Scout stopped. For a moment they stood in the falling snow. Then Scout looked toward the north ridge. Not restless, not frightened, focused. Caleb knew the difference. The same expression Scout had worn before finding the survey marker. The same stubborn concentration he'd shown at the floorboards. Caleb crouched. "What is it?" Scout pulled gently against the collar. Caleb looked back at the truck. Engine off. Bags packed. Everything ready. He could leave. Drive downhill. Find another public land pullout. Another parking lot. Another temporary construction job. Nobody would blame him. Sarah wouldn't. Ben wouldn't. Frank was dead. Even Luke would probably be relieved. Caleb looked at Scout's bandaged shoulder. No running. Scout pulled again. Caleb exhaled. 5 minutes. He took a flashlight, first aid kit, water, and his old compass from the truck. Then he shortened Scout's leash so the dog couldn't surge ahead. They entered the forest. Snow softened every sound. The cabin disappeared behind them. Caleb moved slowly, choosing the gentlest route uphill to protect Scout's stitches. Every 20 or 30 yards he stopped, listened, watched. No lights, no engines, no voices, only snow slipping from branches. Scout led north, past the place where the old barbed wire crossed the brush, past the first survey marker. Caleb stopped there. Scout. The shepherd didn't even look at it. He wanted farther. That caught Caleb's attention. They continued. The forest grew denser. After several minutes, Scout turned west, toward ground Caleb had not searched. The slope steepened. Caleb shortened the leash again. Easy. Scout limped forward, then stopped. Ahead of them, a massive ponderosa had fallen during the storm. Its root plate stood nearly 15 feet high, holding stones and frozen earth between twisted roots. Scout raised his nose, sniffed, then pulled. Caleb followed him around the exposed roots. At first he saw only dirt. Then Scout began pawing. "Don't!" Caleb pulled him back to protect the injured shoulder. He aimed the flashlight. Something beneath the roots reflected a straight edge. Not metal. Stone. Caleb brushed away snow. One rock, then another. Too even. Too square. Placed by hand. His pulse changed. He cleared more snow. Behind the fallen tree, almost completely hidden by the uprooted earth, was a narrow, dark opening in the hillside. Caleb stared into it. Cold air touched his face. Scout stood beside him, breathing hard. This wasn't an animal burrow. Someone had built something here. Years ago. Maybe decades. Caleb swept the flashlight across the entrance. Rotten timber. Stacked stone. A collapsed roofline buried beneath forest soil. He remembered Frank's sentence. Original deed secured separately. Never leave deed and field book together. Caleb looked down at Scout. The shepherd's stitched shoulder trembled from the climb. Caleb rested a hand against his neck. We were leaving. Scout looked into the opening. Caleb turned his flashlight toward the darkness again. For the first time that night, the truck waiting below no longer felt like an escape. It felt like a decision he had almost made too soon. Caleb kept one hand on Scout's collar and aimed the flashlight into the opening. The beam reached perhaps 12 feet before disappearing against packed earth and broken timber. Stones had been stacked along both sides of the entrance. Moss covered most of them, but beneath the green, Caleb could still see the deliberate lines of human hands. Scout tried to move forward. No. Caleb pulled him back. The shepherd looked at him. You found it. I go first. Old habit. Never send the dog or anybody else into a space you hadn't checked yourself. Caleb tied Scout's leash around a thick root several yards from the opening, leaving enough slack for him to lie down. Then he crouched beside the entrance. He studied the ground before stepping on it. Snow had covered almost everything, but he saw no fresh boot impressions, no disturbed branches, no cigarette ends, food wrappers, or recent tool marks. Whatever was inside had probably been waiting a long time. Caleb tested the first overhead timber with the handle of his flashlight. Soft. Rotten. He backed away. This wasn't a bunker. It wasn't a mine. It looked more like an old survey shelter, perhaps built when crews had spent days working remote sections of the ridge. He found a fallen branch and used it to probe the ground. Solid. One step. Pause. Listen. Another. Behind him, Scout whined. I'm right here. The words sounded strangely loud. Inside, Caleb found the remains of a narrow wooden shelf, 2 rusted nails, and part of what might once have been a folding stool. Dirt had pushed through the rear wall. Nothing else. He swept the flashlight lower. Then Scout barked. Once. Sharp. Caleb froze. A faint cracking sound came from above. He looked up. The roof shifted. Back. He moved toward the entrance just as Scout lunged against the leash. The root holding it tore loose. Scout slammed into Caleb's hip. Caleb fell sideways. A section of rotten timber dropped where he had been kneeling. It struck the ground with a heavy crack, throwing dirt and splinters against his jacket. For half a second, Caleb was somewhere else. Dust, concrete, a collapsing wall, a radio voice shouting over static. His hands went flat against frozen earth. His chest stopped moving. Then Scout yelped. Caleb turned. The shepherd had fallen against the stones. A dark line was spreading through the bandage over his stitched shoulder. No, no, no. The memory vanished. Caleb crawled to him. Scout tried to stand. Down. The dog obeyed. Caleb opened the first aid kit with hands that shook only once. He cut away the outer wrap without disturbing the stitches. Too near the upper edge had pulled enough to seep blood, but the wound had not fully opened. He pressed clean gauze against it. Scout licked Caleb's wrist. You've got terrible timing. Scout's tail moved once against the snow. Caleb almost laughed. Almost. He rewrapped the shoulder and sat beside him for several minutes. Going farther inside would be foolish. The shelter was unstable. Scout was injured. Snow was increasing. Every sensible part of Caleb's mind told him to return at daylight with proper tools. Then the flashlight beam crossed something beneath the fallen roof timber. A straight line. Metal. Caleb leaned closer. Behind the timber, partly buried in dirt, was the corner of a box. He stared at it. Scout lifted his head. Yeah. Caleb considered the roof again. He didn't crawl beneath it. Instead, he went outside, found a length of old fence wire among the roots, bent one end into a crude hook, and worked from the safer side of the opening. The first pull brought only dirt. The second moved the box an inch. On the fourth, it slid free. Caleb dragged it into the snow. It was a steel document box, perhaps 16 inches long, heavily corroded around the hinges. No lock. He didn't open it. Not yet. He photographed it where it lay. Then he photographed the shelter entrance, the fallen tree, the surrounding terrain, and the box again from several angles. Frank's field notes had disappeared because Caleb had treated them like old family papers. He would not make that mistake twice. Only after documenting everything did he lift the lid. The hinge complained with a long metallic squeal. Inside were several bundles wrapped in waxed cloth. Caleb unfolded the first. Photographs. Black and white images of survey crews beside tripods and chains. Frank appeared younger in some of them, standing near a marker Caleb recognized. The North Ridge. Another bundle held tax receipts, old ones. Some carried dates from before Caleb was born. Then came letters, county correspondence, survey references, names, parcel numbers. Caleb didn't try to understand them in the snow. He kept going. At the bottom was a large folded sheet. He opened it carefully. An original plat. Across the upper portion were words he had already seen in Frank's notebook. Brooks Ridge Survey, Tract 14. Caleb's flashlight moved across boundary lines stretching far beyond the little cabin parcel. His mouth went dry. Beneath the plat was one final folded document. Thicker paper. A faded notary seal remained visible near the bottom. Caleb read the legal description once, then again. Bearings, monuments, section references. The same numbers Frank had written in the field book. The same tract marked on the survey cap Scout had uncovered. Caleb sat motionless in the snow. Scout pressed his nose against Caleb's arm. You found it. The shepherd watched him. Caleb looked back at the deed. A week earlier, he had been sleeping behind truck stops. Tonight, he was kneeling beside an injured dog with what appeared to be an original land deed in his hands. But he felt no sudden rush of victory. He remembered Sarah's warning. One old document did not erase 50 years of recorded history, and someone had already broken into the cabin for far less than what now rested on his knees. Caleb refolded the deed. He photographed every page. Then he returned each document to its wrapping and placed everything inside a waterproof tool bag from his emergency kit. He left the steel box where he'd found it after photographing its contents and position. By the time they started downhill, Scout was limping badly. Caleb stopped. That's enough. He crouched and slid one arm beneath Scout's chest and the other beneath his hindquarters. His old shoulder protested immediately. 70 pounds was 70 pounds. Caleb lifted anyway. Scout rested his head against Caleb's chest. The descent took nearly 40 minutes. Caleb stopped often, placing Scout down only on level ground while he rested his shoulder and listened to the forest. Nothing followed them. At the cabin, he didn't unpack the truck. He locked the documents inside a metal toolbox, bolted beneath the rear seat, then drove back down the mountain. He needed a phone signal. 2 miles past the old logging gate, one bar appeared. Caleb pulled over. Sarah answered on the fourth ring. Caleb? I found something. Silence. What? A document box. Old tax receipts. Letters. An original plat. He looked at Scout. And a notarized deed. Sarah's voice changed. Where are the documents now? With me. Did you photograph them where you found them? Before I moved anything. Another pause. Good. I learned. Don't take them to the county office. Don't show Luke. Don't tell anyone else what you found. Caleb watched snow collect along the windshield. What do? We preserve the originals. We make controlled copies. Then we verify every document against the county and state records. Caleb looked toward the black outline of Brooks Ridge. So it's real? I didn't say that. He closed his eyes. Sarah continued. I said now we have something we can test. Scout shifted beside him. Caleb rested a hand against the dog's neck. There's more. What? Frank kept tax records going back decades. That matters. And correspondence. What kind? I didn't read all of it. Good. Leave it that way until we can document the contents properly. Caleb stared through the windshield. The discovery should have made him feel richer. Instead, he felt the mountain getting larger around him. The deed wasn't treasure. It was evidence. And evidence created questions. The biggest one was no longer whether Frank had hidden land records. It was why someone had spent years making sure those records stayed hidden. Caleb started the truck. Scout lifted his head. For the first time since packing to leave, Caleb turned the truck toward the cabin instead of away from it. Behind them, beneath the fallen pine, the ruined survey shelter disappeared under fresh snow. But Frank's secret was no longer buried there. It was riding home with the one man Frank had chosen to find it, and the wounded dog who had refused to let him leave before he did. 3 days later, Caleb sat across from Sarah Whitman in a conference room that smelled of old coffee and printer paper. Scout lay beside his chair on a folded blanket. His shoulder had been restitched, and a wide shaved patch showed beneath the clean bandage. Every few minutes he raised his head when footsteps passed the door, then lowered it again when Caleb touched his neck. The steel box was not in the room. Sarah had insisted the original documents be secured separately after they were photographed, cataloged, and placed in protective sleeves. On the table were copies, dozens of them. Megan Price sat beside a licensed surveyor named Daniel Mercer, who had spent 2 days comparing Frank's plat with historical township maps, county indexes, tax records, and modern parcel data. Caleb stared at the papers. So? Sarah folded her hands. The deed appears authentic. Caleb said nothing. Megan slid a copy toward him. The notary was real. The recording references correspond to records from that period. Several monument descriptions match physical markers that still exist. Caleb felt something tighten behind his ribs. Then the land is mine. Sarah shook her head. That's not what I said. The answer landed harder than he expected. Daniel turned the old plat around. Land records don't work like buried treasure, Mr. Brooks. Finding an old deed doesn't erase everything recorded afterward. He pointed to several penciled lines. There were transfers, tax changes, boundary adjustments, at least one access agreement. Some descriptions conflict, some don't. Caleb leaned back. For a week, he had imagined the mystery ending the moment the deed was found. Instead, the table had become a battlefield of paper. Scout pushed his muzzle against Caleb's knee. Caleb scratched behind his ear. Keep going. Megan placed a transparent modern map over Frank's old survey. The mountain changed. Roads appeared. Modern property lines crossed the older boundaries. A large shaded area carried the name North Star Timber and Land. Caleb recognized it immediately. Luke's company. He does acquisition work for them, Sarah said. Not at the executive level, but enough to know what they're buying. Megan traced a finger along the map. North Star owns major timber holdings here and here. 2 large blocks. Between them ran a narrow strip over Brooks Ridge. Frank's tract. Caleb frowned. They want the trees. Daniel shook his head. Some timber has value, but that's not the interesting part. He placed another map on top. This one showed roads, existing roads, proposed roads, terrain contours. Caleb understood before Daniel finished explaining. The ridge formed a natural connection between North Star's holdings, a practical route. Without it, heavy equipment would have to travel around steep terrain, cross another drainage, and use miles of less favorable access. Caleb followed the contour lines with one finger. This cuts straight through. Close to it, Daniel said. Sarah looked at Caleb. Your cabin sits beside the historic approach. Caleb's eyes moved to the tiny square marking Frank's cabin. The building everyone had laughed at. The structure assessed at $1. Luke hadn't offered $30,000 because he wanted a hunting shack. He wanted the doorway to the mountain. Caleb stood and walked to the window. Cars moved slowly along the street below. He remembered Luke's boots, pale ridge clay around the soles, the quick glance north, the sudden offer. $30,000 had sounded generous because Caleb had been sleeping in his truck. Now it sounded cheap. Did Luke know about the deed? We can't prove that, Sarah said. He knew something. Knowing a corridor is strategically useful isn't illegal. Breaking into my cabin is, if he did it. Caleb turned. Sarah didn't look away. Evidence, Caleb, not instinct. He knew that lesson. In Afghanistan, suspicion might keep a man alive. Here, suspicion wouldn't survive a courtroom. Scout suddenly raised his head as a door slammed somewhere down the hallway. Caleb's shoulders tightened. For an instant, the fluorescent lights seemed too bright. White flash. Dust suspended in sunlight. A vehicle stopped crooked in a road. His fingers curled against the windowsill. Then he heard Scout's nails lightly touch the floor. Caleb looked down. The shepherd was watching him. Not the door. Him. Caleb released the windowsill. I'm good. Scout remained alert another moment before lowering his head. Nobody commented. Sarah simply waited until Caleb returned to the table. There was one more item in Frank's box, she said. She opened a file. An envelope rested inside a clear sleeve. Across the front, in faded handwriting, was one word. Caleb. His throat tightened. I didn't see that. It was between 2 folded tax documents. Sarah handed him a copy rather than the original. Caleb recognized Frank's handwriting from the field notes. The letter was short. Frank wrote about a summer years earlier when Caleb had visited after leaving the army. Caleb barely remembered the trip. He had been moving from job to job then, avoiding family gatherings and sleeping badly, even when he had a bed. Frank remembered something different. A broken fence. Caleb had repaired nearly a quarter-mile of it after a windstorm. He had refused money. Frank wrote that most relatives who visited Brooks Ridge eventually asked what the land was worth. Caleb had asked how long it had been in the family. Caleb stopped reading. He could see Frank now, older, lean, gray suspenders, surveyor's hands permanently rough around the knuckle. He hadn't thought about that fence in years. Sarah quietly said, "There's another paragraph." Caleb continued. Frank wrote that land could be sold in an afternoon and regretted for generations. Then came the sentence that made Caleb sit back. If you're reading this, you stayed long enough to understand that the cabin was never the inheritance. It was the gate. Caleb swallowed. Below it, Frank had written, "I needed to know you would care for something before anyone told you what it was worth." Caleb stared at the page. Luke's laughter returned to him. The estate meeting. The $1 assessment. The jokes about his truck. For days, Caleb had carried that humiliation like another piece of evidence that his life had become small enough for people to measure from across a table. Frank had known exactly how the cabin would look. Worthless. That was the point. Caleb rubbed a hand across his face. Old man could have just told me. Sarah almost smiled. Would you have believed him? Caleb looked down at Scout. Probably not. A homeless veteran with an aging truck and a dog had been given a mountain cabin nobody wanted. If Frank had told him it might control access to hundreds of disputed acres, Caleb might have sold before ever seeing it, or Luke might have made sure he never understood what he possessed. Daniel tapped the maps. There's something else you need to understand. Even if the title action goes well, you may not end up owning every acre shown on Frank's original plat. Caleb nodded. He had expected that now. Some later conveyances may be valid, Sarah added. Some easements may remain enforceable. North Star will challenge anything that interferes with its holdings. How long? Months, possibly longer. And money? Sarah hesitated. Enough that we need to be careful. Caleb looked around the table. For once, he didn't feel crushed by the answer. He felt focused. A problem had boundaries now. Documents, survey monuments, recorded transfers, dates, people. He understood problems with boundaries. What happens first? Sarah slid a yellow legal pad toward him. We establish exactly what Frank still owned when he died. And then? We find out what North Star thinks it's entitled to. Caleb looked at the maps. No. Sarah raised an eyebrow. We find out what they can prove they're entitled to. Daniel smiled faintly. That's a better way to put it. Outside, late afternoon sunlight touched the mountain peaks beyond town. Caleb gathered the copies. Scout struggled to his feet. Caleb immediately crouched beside him. Easy. The shepherd leaned into his leg. On the way out, Caleb stopped near Sarah's door. That letter said Frank was testing me. In a way. Then why make the cabin specifically go to me? Why not just put everything in the will? Sarah considered the question. Maybe because a will would have told everyone exactly what mattered. Caleb looked back toward the conference room. Maps covered the table like pieces of a puzzle. Frank had separated the field book from the deed. He had hidden the survey records. He had disguised the importance of the cabin behind a token value. And he had left the key to a man the rest of the family expected to fail. That wasn't eccentricity. It was caution. Caleb's expression changed. Sarah. Yes? If Frank knew someone wanted this corridor badly enough to hide the records, she understood. Then the real question is how long they knew. Caleb looked down at Scout. The shepherd's shoulder had been stitched twice because someone had come searching for Frank's evidence. Suddenly, the hundreds of acres mattered less than one narrow line through them. The corridor, the cabin, the old access route. Caleb had thought Scout had found a hidden deed proving the mountain was the treasure. He had been wrong. The mountain was leverage, and somewhere between Frank's old records and North Star's quiet land purchases was the reason a $1 cabin had become valuable enough for someone to search in the dark. Winter settled over Brooks Ridge before the first formal title conference took place. By then, snow had buried the logging road to the depth of Caleb's boots, and the cabin chimney sent a thin ribbon of smoke into a sky the color of steel. Caleb had patched the worst roof leaks and replaced the broken window with salvaged glass. It still wasn't much of a home, but when the wind came down from the ridge at night, the walls held. Scout's shoulder was healing more slowly. The stitches were gone, but the shepherd still favored his front leg after long walks. On cold mornings, he rose stiffly from beside the wood stove, stretched carefully, then followed Caleb anyway. Caleb had stopped telling him to stay behind. He knew how that argument ended. The legal fight moved slower than either of them. Sarah authenticated Frank's records. Daniel Mercer located additional survey monuments beneath snow, brush, and decades of fallen timber. Megan compared old parcel descriptions against county records one line at a time. North Star responded with lawyers. They challenged boundaries. They questioned old tax receipts. They argued that later conveyances had superseded portions of Frank's survey. Luke submitted a statement claiming Frank had become confused about the historic property lines in his later years. That part nearly broke Caleb's restraint. He read Luke's statement twice in Sarah's office. Then he placed it on the table. Frank was still doing his own bearings. Sarah nodded. "We'll answer with evidence." He knew that ridge better than Luke knows his own driveway. "I know." Caleb's jaw tightened. Sarah waited. Finally, Caleb pushed the statement away. "Evidence." Exactly. Months earlier, he might have driven straight to Luke's house. Now he understood that anger was another way to surrender control. The first major meeting with North Star took place at the county courthouse in February. Scout walked beside Caleb through the hallway. The dog's nails clicked softly against polished tile. Luke stood near a conference room with two North Star representatives and their attorney. He wore a dark wool coat and clean boots. His eyes dropped immediately to Scout's shoulder. The shaved fur had grown back unevenly, leaving a visible scar. Luke looked away. Caleb noticed. He said nothing. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A heavy door slammed somewhere behind Caleb. His body reacted before his mind did. Shoulders forward, weight shifting, eyes searching corners. For one sharp second, the courthouse hallway disappeared. He saw a sun-bleached wall in Afghanistan, a metal door, dust floating through hard white light, someone calling for the route to be cleared. Caleb stopped walking. Scout stopped too. The shepherd leaned against his thigh. Caleb looked down. Scout wasn't looking toward the sound. No raised hackles. No fixed ears. No threat. Caleb exhaled slowly. "Not our AO," he whispered. Scout's tail moved once. Caleb stepped outside. Cold air hit his face. He remained there until the courthouse became a courthouse again. Then he went back inside. He didn't apologize. Sarah didn't ask him to. The title work continued. Weeks became months. Spring runoff exposed survey markers that had been hidden beneath snow. Daniel's fieldwork confirmed several of Frank's original bearings. Archived tax records supported continued ownership interests in key portions of Tract 14, while other areas had indeed been legally transferred over the decades. Caleb was not awarded some magical, untouched 640-acre kingdom. The truth was more complicated, but it was enough. Frank's estate held legitimate title to substantial mountain acreage surrounding the cabin, and, most importantly, land controlling the practical access corridor between North Star's two holdings. Existing easements were clarified. Other claims failed. North Star could no longer behave as though the route belonged to them. They had to negotiate. The offer arrived 2 weeks later. Sarah placed the number in front of Caleb. He stared at it. It was more money than he had earned in years. Enough for a house anywhere he wanted. Enough for a new truck. Enough that he would never have to sleep behind a truck stop again unless he chose to. North Star wanted the entire tract, cabin included. "They're paying for certainty," Sarah said. Caleb looked through her window toward the mountains. And if I sell, they control the corridor. You walk away. No lawsuits? Terms can be written that way. No taxes on land I can't afford to maintain. We'd structure the transaction carefully. But yes, you'd be free of the property. Free. That word followed him back to the cabin. He sat on the porch that evening while snowmelt dripped from the eaves. Scout lay beside him. Caleb held Frank's letter. He read the same sentence again. I needed to know you would care for something before anyone told you what it was worth. A truck climbed the logging road. Scout stood. Caleb folded the letter. Luke stepped from an SUV. He stopped short of the porch. That's a serious offer. Caleb watched him. Sarah tell you the number? Luke gave a small shrug. People talk. Lawyers don't. Luke's expression tightened. You know what I mean. Caleb did. Luke looked toward the ridge. You'd be crazy not to take it. Several months earlier, those words might have worked. Caleb had been measuring his life in gallons of gas, and nights he could park somewhere without being moved along. Luke continued. You don't need 600 acres of rocks and trees. It isn't 600, whatever the final number is. Caleb noticed how quickly Luke dismissed the distinction. The land itself had never mattered to him. Only the route. Luke stepped closer. Take the money. Buy a place in town. Get Scout a fenced yard. Stop fighting over something you didn't even know existed. Caleb's eyes went to Scout. The dog stood quietly between them. A pale scar disappeared beneath his coat. You're right about one thing, Caleb said. Luke waited. I didn't know it existed. Caleb looked toward the forest. But Frank did. Luke's mouth hardened. Frank was an old man holding on to old grudges. Caleb stood. Scout moved with him. That's enough. Luke glanced at the dog, then back at Caleb. You really want to spend the rest of your life guarding a mountain? No. Luke smiled. Then Caleb added, I want to decide what happens to it. The smile disappeared. Luke left without another word. 2 days later, Caleb met Sarah. He declined North Star's purchase offer, but he didn't refuse negotiation. That surprised everyone. Caleb wasn't trying to punish the company. He wasn't interested in becoming a wealthy recluse sitting on land simply because somebody else wanted it. He proposed a limited access easement. One defined route. No expansion without approval. Seasonal restrictions during vulnerable ground conditions. Drainage protections. Revegetation and restoration requirements. No claim to the cabin site or surrounding acreage. North Star would receive the connection it needed. Caleb would keep the mountain. The negotiations were difficult. North Star pushed for wider access. Caleb refused. They wanted future route flexibility. He refused again. When their attorney suggested Caleb should remember his financial circumstances, Sarah started to answer. Caleb raised one hand. He looked across the table. My circumstances are why you thought I'd sell cheap. Nobody spoke. Scout lay beneath the table with his chin across Caleb's boot. Caleb continued, They aren't part of the legal description. Sarah's mouth almost became a smile. The final agreement took another 6 weeks. When Caleb eventually signed it, his hand was steady. The easement payment was enough to clear his debts, repair the cabin, establish savings, and give him something he had not possessed in years. Time. Not luxury. Time. Time to sleep without wondering where he would park tomorrow. Time to decide which work he accepted. Time to rebuild instead of merely survive. Outside Sarah's office, Caleb stood beside his old Ford. The truck still had rust over the rear wheel well, The passenger door still needed to be lifted slightly before it would close. Scout climbed in carefully. Caleb didn't immediately start the engine. He looked toward the mountains beyond town. Frank had left him property. Scout had found the evidence. Sarah, Megan, and Daniel had helped prove what the evidence actually meant. But Caleb understood something none of the legal documents could describe. Months ago, Luke had laughed because Caleb appeared to own nothing. Now North Star was paying him for permission to cross land he had once been mocked for accepting. Yet the money wasn't the part that made Caleb sit quietly behind the wheel. He had been offered enough to abandon the mountain. He had chosen instead to draw a line through it. A fair line. A useful line. A line that allowed others through without giving away the ground beneath his own feet. Scout placed one paw on Caleb's leg. Caleb looked at him. Home? Scout's ears lifted. Caleb started the truck. As they climbed toward Brooks Ridge, afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds and stretched across the snow. The cabin appeared around the final bend. Small, weathered, still standing. For the first time, Caleb didn't see the $1 structure everyone else had rejected. He saw a porch that needed rebuilding, a chimney that needed another brace, a dog that would need an easier way up the steps when winter returned, and a place that was finally his because he had refused both ways of losing it, being forced off the land, or selling all of it simply because someone had finally offered enough money. He parked beside the cabin. Scout stepped down slowly. Then the shepherd waited. Caleb came around the truck, and together they walked toward the door. Behind them, the mountain remained quiet. Ahead of them was work. But for the first time in years, Caleb knew the difference between surviving somewhere and belonging there. By the time October returned to Brooks Ridge, the cabin no longer leaned into the weather as if waiting for permission to collapse. Caleb had replaced the worst roof sections, rebuilt the chimney, reinforced the porch, and installed a small solar system that kept the lights on after sunset. The old windows had been repaired instead of replaced, and the rough pine walls still carried Frank's hammer marks beneath decades of stain. Nothing about the place looked expensive. Caleb preferred it that way. Beside the porch steps was the one addition nobody could mistake for decoration. A wooden ramp. Scout was 8 now. Most days he could still climb the steps, but cold mornings stiffened the shoulder that had been torn open on the ridge. Sometimes he stood at the bottom, looked at the stairs, and chose the ramp without embarrassment. Caleb understood that too. Some injuries didn't disappear because enough time had passed. You simply learned another way around them. At 2:06 November morning, a branch snapped outside the bedroom window. Caleb's eyes opened. His hand moved toward the nightstand. Nothing was there except a flashlight and a glass of water. For several seconds, he listened. Wind. Pine needles brushing the roof. The low hum of the refrigerator. His pulse remained too fast. A strip of moonlight crossed the floor, and for an instant it became another light entirely. Hard Afghan sunlight flashing across metal beside a road. Caleb sat up. He checked the window. Tree line, porch, truck, clear. Then he looked at Scout. The shepherd had raised his head from the rug. His ears turned toward the window. He listened. 5 seconds. 10. Then Scout lowered his head again with a long sigh. Caleb remained sitting. You sure? Scout didn't move. Caleb almost checked outside anyway. Instead, he lay back down. The first time he tried that, sleep didn't return for nearly an hour. Months later, sometimes it returned in 10 minutes. Progress, Caleb had learned, rarely announced itself. Sometimes it was simply choosing not to check the door a third time. Morning came pale and cold. Caleb made coffee while Scout ate beside the stove. A pickup arrived shortly after 8, carrying Hank Doyle and 2 volunteers from a veterans housing group in town. Caleb had first heard about the organization through Deputy Ben Carter. They repaired neglected rural homes for veterans who had nowhere stable to go after medical bills, divorce, unemployment, or years of moving from one temporary place to another. Caleb understood the part nobody put in the brochures. Sometimes a man didn't need someone to save him. He needed a door that would still belong to him tomorrow. Caleb had used part of the North Star easement income to fund materials for 3 small renovation projects. More importantly, he went with the crews. He repaired joists, rewired damaged outlets, replaced windows, crawled beneath houses nobody else wanted to crawl beneath. He never told the veterans living there that he understood. He didn't need to. One afternoon, while replacing porch boards on an old farmhouse outside town, a nail gun fired unexpectedly behind him. Caleb dropped his hammer and turned so fast his shoulder struck a post. Everyone stopped. The young volunteer holding the nail gun went pale. "Sorry, sir." Caleb's breathing was shallow. Scout, lying beneath the truck, immediately stood and crossed the yard. Caleb put his hand on the dog's back. "It's all right." Nobody asked for an explanation. A minute later, Caleb picked up his hammer. "Give me a warning before you fire that thing next to my ear." The volunteer nodded. "Yes, sir." Then they went back to work. That was enough. By early winter, Sarah had completed the final paperwork connected to Frank's estate and the North Star agreement. The corridor remained limited to the negotiated route, and restoration work had already begun along sections disturbed during access improvements. Luke never returned to the cabin. Caleb heard he had taken a job in another county. He felt no satisfaction from that. Somewhere along the way, anger had stopped being useful. Frank's letter remained inside the cabin desk. The hidden deed was secured properly now, protected from moisture, fire, and curious hands. But Caleb rarely looked at either. He didn't need paper to remind him why he had stayed. Scout did that every morning. One clear December afternoon, Caleb loaded a small plaque and a post into the truck. Scout watched from the passenger seat. One trip. The shepherd's ears rose. They drove as far as the snow allowed, then walked toward the North Ridge. Caleb shortened his pace for Scout. Years earlier, Scout would have ranged ahead, circling through trees and returning to check him. Now he stayed closer. At the uprooted ponderosa, Caleb brushed snow away until the old survey cap appeared. Brooks, Tract 14, N.E. Corner. The discovery that had started everything. Caleb drove the post into the ground several feet away, careful not to disturb the monument. The plaque was simple. Frank Brooks, surveyor. He knew where the lines were. No acreage, no dollar amount, no mention of North Star. Caleb stepped back. Scout sat beside him. Think he'd complain? Scout sneezed. Caleb smiled. Yeah. Probably. Wind moved through the ponderosas. Caleb stood quietly, remembering the estate room and Luke's joke. The only real estate worth less than Caleb's truck. Back then, Caleb had believed the worst part was that everyone saw him as a man with nothing. He understood now that he had been doing the same thing to himself. Measuring his life by what remained. One truck, one duffel bag, a few tools, a dog. No permanent address. No plan beyond the next job. But Scout had never measured him that way. The dog had followed him into parking lots and mountain storms with exactly the same loyalty he now carried onto 600 disputed acres. To Scout, Caleb had never become worth less. The thought stayed with him as they started toward the cabin. Halfway down the ridge, Scout stopped. His head turned toward the forest. Caleb stopped too. Old instinct tightened his shoulders. His eyes moved automatically. Near tree, far tree, ravine, high ground, movement, nothing. Scout took 2 steps toward the woods. Caleb's hand tightened around the walking stick. Then Scout's tail began to move. A mule deer stepped between the trees. Another followed. A young deer appeared behind them. They watched Caleb and Scout for several seconds before moving silently through the snow. Caleb exhaled. Scout looked back at him. For years, every unexplained sound had carried a question. Where is the threat? Every flash of light, every vehicle slowing near him, every door closing too hard. His body had learned to answer before his mind could speak. Scout had saved him more than once by noticing danger first. But somewhere on this mountain, the dog had begun teaching him something harder. How to notice when danger wasn't there. Come on. Scout returned to his side. The cabin appeared below them through the trees. Smoke rose from the chimney. Warm light filled the windows. Caleb could see the rebuilt porch, the stacked firewood, the truck beside the shed, and Scout's ramp carrying a thin layer of fresh snow. A year earlier, Caleb had slept behind truck stops and woken whenever headlights crossed his windshield. Now there was a pantry stocked for winter. Tools hanging above a workbench, boots drying beside a stove, people in town who expected him on Monday morning. A mountain he had protected without having to lock it away from everyone else. And enough money to live without allowing money to decide what kind of man he would become. At the porch, Scout climbed halfway up the steps. He stopped. His injured shoulder stiffened. Caleb waited. Scout considered the remaining stairs, backed down, and walked calmly to the ramp. Caleb opened the door. Warm air rolled out. Scout entered first and settled beside the wood stove. Caleb hung his coat. For a moment he stood in the center of the room and listened. The stove ticking, wind against the roof, Scout breathing. Nothing remarkable. That was what made it remarkable. He walked to the window. Far beyond the glass lay Frank's survey line, the hidden shelter, the corridor, and all the ground people had fought to own. Caleb finally understood why the deed had never been Frank's greatest gift. The land had value. The easement had value. The documents had value. But none of them could tell Caleb what his own life was worth. The $1 cabin had simply given him somewhere to remain long enough to discover it for himself. Behind him, Scout gave a quiet groan and rolled onto his side. Caleb turned off the porch light. He checked the lock once. Only once. Then he sat beside the stove and rested his hand against Scout's scarred shoulder. Outside, something moved through the trees. Scout lifted one ear. Caleb waited. The ear lowered again. This time Caleb didn't go to the window. He added one piece of wood to the fire and listened to the mountain settle into darkness. Tomorrow there would be fences to repair, snow to clear, and another old house in the valley waiting for Caleb's crew. Tonight, there was only the cabin, the dog, and the quiet. For years, Caleb had believed home was the place where a man finally became safe. He knew better now. Home was the place where, little by little, he learned he no longer had to live as if nowhere was safe. Scout closed his eyes. A moment later, Caleb did too. And maybe that's what home really means. Not a place where nothing can hurt you, but a place where you finally believe tomorrow is worth waking up for. If Caleb and Scout's journey stayed with you, leave a simple one in the comments. If you believe every veteran deserves a place to call home, leave a 0. I'd love to see how many of you made this journey with them all the way to the end. And subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories waiting beyond the next ridge. Stories of veterans, loyal dogs, forgotten places, and the secrets that can give a broken life a new beginning. Until the next story, take care of yourself. Take care of the ones who never leave your side. And remember, Sometimes the thing everyone else calls worthless is exactly where a new life begins.